They didn't tell me I was losing control. They let me discover it slowly. At first, it was small things. My son changing the Wi-Fi password without telling me. My daughter organizing my paperwork in folders I hadn't asked for. My youngest suggesting I keep a spare key just in case. Just in case. Those three words have more power than people realize. My name is Victor Langston. I'm 92 years old. And 3 months ago, I realized my children had begun preparing for a version of me that didn't exist yet. I bought this house in 1974 with my wife, Elaine. Back then, this neighborhood was half dirt and half hope. We paid $71,000. I remember standing in the empty living room while Elaine pressed her palm against the wall and said, "This will hold our life." And it did. 3 children learned to walk on these floors. Birthday candles melted onto this dining table. Arguments echoed in this hallway. Apologies followed. Elaine passed 8 years ago. Lung disease. Slow. Painful. The kind of ending that forces you to watch someone fade. After she was gone, people expected me to crumble. But I didn't. I adjusted. I learned to cook more than eggs. I learned where she kept the holiday decorations. I learned how to sleep without reaching for someone who wasn't there. I wasn't broken. I was grieving. There's a difference. The first serious conversation happened on a Sunday. They always choose Sundays. Comfort food softens hard topics. My oldest, Richard, cleared his throat mid-dinner. That sound again. The sound of rehearsal. "Dad." He began carefully. "We've been thinking." "We." I kept chewing. My daughter, Claire, leaned forward. "You've done amazing on your own. Truly. But maybe it's time to consider something safer." Safer? From what? The walls? The staircase I've climbed for 48 years? My youngest, Matthew, pulled out his phone. There are independent senior communities now. Not nursing homes. Real independence. Funny how independence now comes with brochures. I set my fork down. When exactly did I say I was unsafe? Silence. And that silence told me everything. They had already discussed it. Without me. 2 weeks later, I confirmed what I already suspected. I woke up thirsty around 1:30 in the morning. As I passed the den, I heard voices. Low. Measured. Serious. I stopped. Richard was speaking. He won't agree easily. Claire responded, "We might have to ease him into it." Ease me into it. Like a transition. Like a child. Then Matthew said something that changed everything. "Do you know what houses here are selling for?" Pause. Over 2.3 million. The number hung in the air. 2.3 million. When Elaine and I bought this house, we celebrated if we saved $20 at the grocery store. Now, my life had market value. Richard sighed. If something happens to him suddenly, probate could freeze everything for months. Him. Not Dad. Him. And that was the moment I understood something painful. I wasn't the center of the concern. Timing was. The next morning, I didn't confront them. I made an appointment. Estate planning attorney. Her name was Amelia Carter. Sharp eyes. Soft voice. Serious mind. She asked me questions calmly. "What day is it?" "Tuesday." "Who manages your finances?" "Ido." "Any diagnosis of cognitive decline?" "No." She folded her hands. "Then legally, Mr. Langston, no one can force you to sell your home or relocate unless you're declared incompetent by a court." I felt something return to my chest. Air. Authority. But then she added, "You need to protect yourself before anyone attempts to question your capacity." Attempt. That word stayed with me. Because love and pressure sometimes are the same face. We updated everything. New will. Revocable living trust. Healthcare directive. Durable power of attorney. Chosen by me. But I didn't stop there. I added a clause. Clear. Unambiguous. The property cannot be sold, transferred, or leveraged during my lifetime without my explicit written consent. Not implied. Not encouraged. Written. Signed. Verified. After my passing, the estate is divided equally. Fair. Transparent. Balanced. But while I am breathing, This house remains mine. I thought that would end it. It didn't. 3 weeks later, Richard showed up alone, unannounced. He sat at my kitchen table, the one with the burn mark from a 1988 Thanksgiving mishap, and didn't touch his coffee. "Dad," he said, "can I ask you something honestly?" "You just did." He tried to smile. It didn't reach his eyes. "If something were to happen suddenly, would you want us scrambling?" There was again. Suddenly. He wasn't worried about my fall. He was worried about uncertainty. "Are you in trouble?" I asked calmly. His jaw tightened. "No, too fast." A father knows the difference between truth and pride. I didn't push further, but I started watching more carefully. And what I noticed over the next month told me this story was deeper than safety. Much deeper. Richard refinanced his house recently. Matthew's startup wasn't doing well. Claire's divorce settlement had stretched her thin. They weren't greedy. They were strained. And strain makes people rationalize. They weren't waiting for me to die. They were waiting for relief. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me cautious. Because when money enters the room, emotions rearrange themselves. Then something happened that shifted everything. I slipped on the back porch. Not badly, just enough to bruise my hip. Claire insisted on taking me to urgent care. The diagnosis? Minor bruise. No fracture. But while I sat there in that hospital room, I watched my children stand in the hallway whispering. Again, whispering. And I saw something in Richard's posture. Urgency, not fear. Urgency. That's when I understood. My independence wasn't just inconvenient. It was unpredictable. And unpredictability is uncomfortable for people carrying financial stress. That night, I made a decision. Not defensive, strategic. I scheduled a full cognitive and physical evaluation. Voluntarily. Comprehensive testing. Memory recall. Processing speed. Executive function. Balance assessment. Results? Above average cognition for my age. Physically stable. Doctor's written statement. Patient is mentally competent and capable of independent living. I handed each of my children a copy, and I said calmly, "You don't get to age me faster than I am." Claire cried. Matthew looked relieved. Richard said nothing, but I saw something in his eyes. Calculation again. And that's when I realized this wasn't over. Because when someone feels financial pressure, logic doesn't always end the argument. It just changes tactics. And I had a feeling the next tactic would not be subtle. It would be formal. And when it arrived, it would test not just my legal preparation, but my relationship with my own children. And what happened next would force me to make the hardest decision of my life. The paperwork arrived on a Thursday. Certified mail. No return address I recognized. I knew before I opened it that it wasn't casual. Inside was a formal notice. Petition for evaluation of capacity. Filed by Richard Langston, my oldest son, my executor, until 2 months ago. The document was polite, clinical, concerned. It stated that due to recent incidents suggesting possible cognitive instability, a court-supervised evaluation was being requested to determine whether I remained capable of managing my affairs. Recent incidents. I had slipped on my porch. That was the incident. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. The same table where he had once built model airplanes. The same table where I had taught him long division. And I realized something important. He didn't think he was betraying me. He thought he was solving a problem. The problem just happened to be me. I didn't call him. I called Amelia. She didn't sound surprised. "This happens more often than people think," she said calmly. "Especially when property values are high and there's financial strain in the family." Strain. Again, that word. "Can they win?" I asked. "They can try," she replied. "But they need evidence, not speculation." I already had medical documentation. But that wasn't enough. Because courtrooms aren't just about truth. They're about narrative. And the narrative was being shaped without me. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later. 3 weeks of silence. Richard didn't visit. Claire called once, her voice small. "Dad, I didn't know he filed it." I believed her. Matthew texted, "This isn't how I wanted this handled." Interesting phrasing. Not this is wrong, just not how he wanted it handled. You learn a lot about people through word choice. In those 3 weeks, something unexpected happened. I began reviewing more than legal documents. I reviewed my life, not sentimentally, strategically. If my children believed I was fragile, then I needed to demonstrate structure, consistency, vision. So I started making visible improvements. Repaired the porch step myself. Installed additional lighting along the hallway. Added handrails, not because I needed them, but because I could. Perception matters. I also did something else, something they wouldn't expect. I began volunteering at the local community center. Twice a week. Financial literacy workshops for young adults. Budgeting, debt management, long-term planning. I didn't advertise it to my children, but word travels in small cities. And I knew eventually they would hear. The hearing room was smaller than I imagined. No dramatic courtroom. Just a judge, a clerk, attorneys, and family. Richard looked tired, more tired than angry. His lawyer presented the petition calmly, cited risk factors, advanced age, recent fall, living alone. He made it sound mathematical. Risque plus asset équal intervention. It was my turn. Amelia stood beside me. She presented the cognitive evaluation, the physician's written statement, photos of the home modifications, documentation of my volunteer work, bank statements showing organized financial management. Then she did something brilliant. She asked me to speak, not defend. Speak. So I did. Your Honor, I began, I am 92 years old. I have outlived my wife, most of my friends, and 2 doctors. I understand risk, but risk is not incapacity. If we remove autonomy from everyone who might fall someday, then none of us are qualified to stand. Silence. Then I added, my children love me, but love mixed with anxiety can look like control. I'm not asking the court to ignore concern. I am asking it to respect competence. The judge studied me for a long moment. Then he spoke. Petition denied. Just like that. One sentence. Richard's shoulders dropped. Not in anger, in defeat. And something else. Fear. Outside the courthouse, we stood in an awkward cluster. Claire hugged me tightly. Matthew shook my hand, then pulled me into a quick embrace. Richard stayed a few steps back. Finally, he approached. I was trying to protect everyone, he said quietly. From what? I asked. He hesitated. Then the truth slipped out. The market won't stay like this forever. There it was. Not my safety. Timing. Opportunity. Value. He wasn't planning my funeral. He was planning liquidity. And that's when I saw the full picture. His refinance had variable interest. Matthew's startup needed bridge funding. Claire was paying legal fees still. They weren't villains. They were leveraged. And leverage makes urgency feel moral. That night, I sat alone in the living room. Elaine's photo on the mantel. I spoke to her the way I sometimes do. They're scared, I said softly. But they're not wrong about one thing. I'm 92. Time is not theoretical. So I asked myself a difficult question. Was I protecting independence or postponing inevitability? There's a difference. One is strength. The other is denial. And I needed to be honest with myself before I could be honest with them. The next Sunday, I invited all 3 of them to dinner. No ambus, no tensión, just food. We ate quietly at first. Then I placed a folder in the center of the table. Not legal documents, not threats, plans. I've been thinking, I began. I saw Richard flinch slightly at the phrase. I'm not moving. Not now. But I also won't pretend time doesn't move forward. They listened carefully. I've structured a controlled equity release plan. Blank looks. So I explained. A secured line of credit against the property. Limited. Strategic. And used unless I authorize it. But accessible. Flexible. No for sale. No probat freeze. Liquidity without surrender. Richard's eyes widened slightly. You do that. I would consider it. I corrected. Under conditions. Conditions. That word shifted the power dynamic immediately. What conditions? Claire asked. Transparency. I said. Full financial disclosure from each of you. If this family is going to treat my home like an asset, then we treat everything like shared reality. Silence. Because transparency is harder than inheritance. I continued. No secrets. No whispered conversations. If someone needs help, we talk about it. Directly. As adults. Matthew looked down first. Then Richard exhaled slowly. You're serious. I am. Because here's the truth. Money divides families in the dark. But in the light, it forces maturity. Over the next hour, something happened that hadn't happened in years. Honesty. Richard admitted the refinance was heavier than he'd projected. Matthew admitted he was 6 months from shutting down his company. Claire admitted she was afraid of starting over at 58. No one was evil. They were overwhelmed. And overwhelm had turned into urgency. Urgency had turned into control. And control had nearly turned into court-ordered removal of my autonomy. All because no one wanted to admit vulnerability. We didn't finalize anything that night. But we shifted something more important than paperwork. We shifted posture. Richard looked at me differently. Not as a ticking clock. As a strategist. Matthew asked if I'd review his financial projections. Claire asked if she could come by during the week. Not to monitor, just to visit. And as they left, I felt something unexpected. Not victory. Stability. Because independence doesn't mean isolation. It means choice. And for the first time since this began, I felt like choice had returned to the table. But here's what no one tells you about restoring balance. It's fragile. And sometimes, when power shifts quietly, someone outside the family notices. 3 days later, Amelia called. Victor, she said carefully, there's something you should know. A developer had made a private inquiry. Not to me, to Richard, regarding off-market acquisition interest. They weren't just watching the housing market. They were watching my house, specifically. And that meant one thing. This wasn't just family pressure anymore. This was external opportunity circling. And when outside money smells internal tension, it accelerates everything. I looked around my living room slowly, the light through the curtains. The faint mark on the wall where Elaine once hung a painting crooked. The floorboards that still creak near the stairs. This house held memory. But to someone else, it held margin. And now I had to decide something bigger than autonomy. I had to decide whether protecting this house was about love or about pride. And that decision would change not just my relationship with my children, but the legacy I leave behind. If you've listened this far, remember this. Independence is not about refusing help, and love is not about controlling someone for their own good. Talk before fear turns into action. Be honest about money before it becomes silent pressure. Put your plans in writing before someone else writes them for you. Protect your dignity, but don't let pride isolate you. And if you are the child, remember, your parents are not problems to be managed. They are people who once carried you when you could not stand. Respect their voice while they still have it. Because in the end, the greatest inheritance you can leave or receive isn't property. It's trust.